So in this Black History Month video, we're going to talk about Jamaica Kincaid's short story, Girl, which I'm reading out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature, Volume F, on the 20th and 21st centuries. Now, when I say short story, I mean from here to there. This is a very, very, very short story, but it's so good. And the story actually made Kincaid's reputation as a writer because it was one of the first, if not the first, that she published professionally. And it brought a lot of attention to her, both for its experimental components, but also for its exploration of gendered experience, particularly the gendered experience of a young woman growing up in Antigua, which is where Kincaid is from. This short story, again, from here to there, is one sentence. Is one long sentence. And this is, I mean, in the 70s, people loved literary experimentation. This was the high point of postmodernism. And so having a text, having a story that is all one sentence, it is that sort of literary and stylistic experimentation that people were really into at the time. It's especially impressive because there's dialogue. There are multiple voices here. The majority of the story is the mother of the girl, but there are a couple of instances in italics here. You can't really see that very well, but there are a couple of instances in italics here where we actually get the girl's voice responding to things that her mother has said. Having dialogue within a one-sentence short story is incredibly innovative. There are also end punctuation pieces in here, but they don't actually signal the end of a sentence. So, for instance, let me see if I can spot one. For instance, there are a couple of places where we get a question mark. Yeah, so right here, for instance, we have, you can't really see it all that well on here, but we have a question mark. Let me see if, that doesn't really help. But we have a question mark and a semicolon, a semicolon. So a lot of these, the reason ultimately this is one sentence is because thoughts are strung together with semicolons. There are places where there is a question mark, which is typically an end piece of punctuation, followed by a semicolon. So we have here that literary experimentation that would have put Kincaid very much in the literary and stylistic realm of the mid to late 70s. So what's the story actually about? Well, Girl is focused on the mother giving advice about how to properly be a woman. This is a wide variety of different types of advice. Things about cleaning, things about cooking, things about medicine, things about how to deal with a husband who's potentially abusive, all of these different kinds of things. So the story starts, for instance, wash the white clothes on Monday and put them on the stone heap. Wash the color clothes on Tuesday and put them on the clothesline to dry. Don't walk barehead in the hot sun. Cook pumpkin fritters in very hot sweet oil. Soak your little cloths right after you take them off. When buying cotton to make yourself a nice blouse, be sure it doesn't have gum on it, because that way it won't hold up well after a wash. And it goes on from here. A lot of this is this same kind of advice about how to run a household. And so that's significant because also in the 70s, this was a sort of high watermark of second wave feminism, where people were challenging and interrogating these social restrictions placed on women and these not stereotypical necessarily, but these traditional boundaries to women's experience. Women being within the domestic sphere, et cetera, was coming increasingly under challenge. And the just rapid fire list of advice here evokes that sort of sense of how difficult it is for women to navigate the patriarchal world of the 1970s and before. There are so many things you need to keep in mind, so many things you need to know, because again, the concern about domestic abuse comes up here, because if you don't successfully navigate this world, you are vulnerable. And this idea also of vulnerability, of social vulnerability, comes up repeatedly because the mother is continually using this kind of phrasing. She says, on Sundays, try to walk like a lady and not like the slut you are so bent on becoming. And a little bit later, she says, this is how to hem a dress when you see the hem coming down, and so to prevent yourself from looking like the slut I know you are so bent on becoming. This is how to behave in the presence of men who don't know you very well, and this way they won't recognize immediately the slut I have warned you against becoming. And then at the end, she says, always squeeze bread to make sure it's fresh. The daughter says, but what if the baker won't let me feel the bread? And the mother says, you mean to say that after all, you are really going to be the kind of woman who the baker won't let near the bread? So this idea of behave properly, fit the mold, don't do anything out of line. Don't in any way challenge things. Make sure that you do exactly as you're told, or you will be a slut. This is a very powerful technique of social control and of shaming to keep this daughter in line. And the fact that this comes up at least 4 times, this particular kind of shaming technique, again, it's 4 times in a page of text printed in this book. That reflects the overwhelming social anxiety about proper behavior for women under this patriarchal system. So those are sort of the key things that are really, really central to the text, are these sort of ideas of literary experimentation and gender roles. But there's a couple of other things that I think are worth noting. And this one actually is related to gender roles as well. This came out in 1978. So for the US, this was post Roe v. Wade, but one of the pieces of advice here is, this is how to make a good medicine to throw away a child before it even becomes a child. So even though this is post Roe v. Wade, and in principle abortion in the US was legal, again, I don't know in Antigua what the situation was in 1978 in terms of abortion rights, reproductive rights. Kincaid was in New York, I think. She was in the US when this story was published. But that idea of abortion needs to be done through potions, through sort of backdoor chemists, through illicit operations and things like this. Abortion was incredibly dangerous and becomes again incredibly dangerous in societies like many places in the US right now that attempt to criminalize it. It does not actually lower rates of abortion. There's no evidence to suggest that whatsoever. But taking a potion to induce an abortion is dangerous. Women died of this. And so that's worth noting. But the other thing I want to talk about just briefly is this line, "Don't throw stones at blackbirds because it might not be a blackbird at all." For many white American readers, that's likely to be kind of an odd thing. And while Kincaid was raised Methodist, her, according to the introduction here, her mother and grandmother practiced Obeah, which was a West Indian voodoo, basically a derivation of I think it's a derivation of Haitian voodoo that in sort of Anglophone portions of the Caribbean gets slightly adapted. I'm not entirely sure exactly what the distinctions are there, because it's not really my area of expertise. But this idea of blackbirds might not be blackbirds at all, in at least certain branches of voodoo, there is a belief that spirits can come back and inhabit particular animals or particular places or things like this. And in the particular version of Antiguan, I think I'm pronouncing that right, voodoo that Kincaid was familiar with, blackbirds were a very common creature that spirits were said to inhabit. So that's an interesting note, both because it's one of the few things in here that overtly points us to the author's Caribbean heritage, or to suggest that this story is set in the Caribbean, because we don't get any setting or scenic details or anything like that. But again, it's also linked to this idea of social control. Not necessarily overtly along gendered lines, but this is another thing that the girl, the daughter who's being addressed by the mother, needs to remember in order to behave properly. And that's such an overwhelming anxiety of this very, very short story. That's where we are with this. Basically, it's almost an anxiety-inducing experience to read, even though it's such a brilliantly written short story, because it is just that list of here's a thing to remember, here's a thing to remember, here's a thing to remember, here's a thing to remember.